The general stands in a room without windows. Torchlight carves shadows into the stone walls. His armor is still on. He hasn't slept in 3 days. Outside, 15,000 legionaries wait in the darkness, their breath forming clouds in the cold Italian air. They don't know why they've been marched here. They don't know what name they'll be shouting by morning. The general holds a letter. It's from Rome. The seal is broken. The words are simple. One sentence that will either make him emperor, turn him into a corpse displayed on the Gemonian stairs. He reads it again. Then he folds the parchment slowly, places it near the flame, watches the corner blacken, curl, catch. The smoke rises. Somewhere beyond the walls, a dog begins to bark. And the general realizes in this exact moment that he has just passed a point he can never return from. That whatever happens next, the man who entered this room will not be the man who leaves it. He doesn't know yet that before the year ends, 4 men will wear purple, that Rome will burn again, that the temples will run with the blood of senators, that the Danube will freeze solid enough to carry an army across, and that army will be coming for him. He only knows one thing standing there in the torchlight. Rome doesn't play fair. And tonight, neither will he. The city stank of fear that winter, not the ordinary fear of a brutal regime, not the familiar terror of emperors who killed from a distance, who signed death warrants in villas overlooking the sea. This was different. This was the smell of uncertainty. The streets were quieter than they should have been, fewer merchants hawking goods in the forum, fewer children playing in the alleys. The men who gathered in the shadows of temples spoke in whispers, their eyes constantly moving, watching for faces that didn't belong, because Nero was dead. The last of the Julio Claudians had stabbed himself in a villa outside the city, abandoned by his guards, his slaves, everyone. A freedman had held the knife steady, while Nero pressed his throat against it. That was how the dynasty ended, not with thunder, but with a throat opening in the dark. And now there was nothing. No heir, no succession plan, no system for what came next. Just Rome, holding its breath, waiting to see who would grab for the purple first. The marble of the Senate House gleamed cold in the winter light. The statues of past emperors stared down at empty benches. And somewhere in the city, men who had spent their entire lives pretending to be loyal were beginning to calculate. The empire ran on fear. And now the source of that fear was gone. What took its place? He was 70 years old when they made him emperor. Servius Sulpicius Galba sat in a drafty palace room, wrapped in wool blankets, staring at paperwork that made no sense. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from exhaustion. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it. But when Nero's rebellion gained momentum, when the Praetorian Guard abandoned the old line, when the Senate declared him emperor in absentia, was he supposed to do? Say no. Galba had served Rome for 50 years, governed provinces, commanded legions, survived the madness of Caligula, the cruelty of Claudius, the terror of Nero. He knew how power worked, knew that it flowed through connections, through favors, through the careful management of men who could never be fully trusted. But he had never been emperor, and there was no manual for that. The men who surrounded him now were strangers. His old friends were dead or useless. His advisors were men he'd inherited from Nero's court-smooth, smiling men who bowed too deeply and never met his eyes. They brought him documents to sign, appointments to make, decisions that would affect millions. Galba signed. What else could he do? Outside the palace windows, the city waited. The legions waited. The provinces waited. They were all watching an old man with shaking hands, trying to decide if he was strong enough to hold the empire together. Galba wondered the same thing. And in the darkness of his own mind, he already knew the answer. But emperors don't actually rule Rome. They sit in the palace. They sign documents. They give speeches. But the real machinery of power operates elsewhere in places the public never sees. The Praetorian Guard, for example. 2,000 men camped just outside the city walls. They had weapons, they had training. They had the only organized military force within striking distance of the Senate. And they had a long memory. They remembered how Nero had paid them, how Caligula had entertained them, how Claudius had been carried into the palace on their shoulders, trembling and terrified after they'd murdered his predecessor. The Praetorians didn't care about law, didn't care about tradition. They cared about one thing, their bonus, the donativum. The payment an emperor gave them upon accession, a bribe dressed up as tradition, a way of saying asterisk, I know you could kill me, so here's money not to. Galba refused to pay it. His advisors warned him, begged him, told him that every emperor for decades had paid the bribe, that this was how the game was played, that refusing was suicide. Galba looked at them with cold, old eyes. Levy soldiers, he said. I don't buy them. The words were noble. The words were principled. The words were the kind of thing Romans told themselves about their ancestors, about the old republic, about a time when men served for honor instead of gold. But that time was dead. And in refusing to pay, Galba had just signed his own death warrant. He just didn't know it yet. The problem was obvious to everyone except Galba. He had no son, no heir. No young man being trained to take over when age finally caught up with him. In a system with no rules for succession, that was an invitation to civil war. His advisors pressed him constantly. Asterisk, choose someone, adopt. Give the empire a direction, a future, something to hold on to. Asterisk Galba listened, nodded, and did nothing. Because the man he should have chosen was obvious. Marcus Salvius Otho was young, handsome, popular with the aristocracy, popular with the guard, connected in all the right ways. He'd been one of Nero's inner circle, had partied with the emperor, knew how the game was played. More importantly, he'd been the first governor to declare for Galba during the rebellion. He'd thrown his support behind the old man when it mattered most, when the outcome was still uncertain. Otho expected to be rewarded. Every day, he walked through the palace corridors, smiling at guards, nodding to slaves, projecting confidence. Every night, he waited for the summons that would make him Galba's son, Galba's heir, the next emperor of Rome. The summons never came. Instead, Galba made a different choice. Lucius Calpurnius, Piso young, noble, untested. A man with an ancient name and no political base, no connections to the guard, no experience in the brutal reality of imperial politics. He was the kind of choice a man makes when he wants to be remembered as principled, when he wants history to record that he did the right thing instead of the smart thing. Otho heard the news in his rooms. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he began to calculate. That night, 3 men met in a house on the Palatine Hill. The windows were shuttered. The lamps were low. The slaves had been dismissed. Otho sat across from 2 Praetorian officers, watching their faces in the flickering light, measuring how far he could trust them, which wasn't far. Trust was a luxury for men who didn't need power. These men could betray him by morning, could take his confession straight to Galba, could watch him executed before sunset. They had all the leverage. He had nothing but promises, but promises could be enough. Otho laid out the plan, simple, brutal, the kind of plan that only works when everyone involved knows they'll die if it fails. The officers listened, nodded, asked questions about money, about position, about what they'd get in return. Otho told them everything they wanted to hear. When they left, he sat alone in the darkness, staring at nothing. He could still back out, could still pretend this conversation never happened, could still walk into the palace tomorrow and smile at Piso, and wait for whatever scraps Galba threw his way. He didn't move. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the rooftops, and somewhere in the city men were sharpening blades. The morning was cold and gray. Galba had been emperor for 7 months. He was making his way to the forum for a routine sacrifice, surrounded by his guards, his advisors, the usual crowd of hangers-on who attached themselves to power like barnacles to a ship. Piso walked beside him, young, confident, believing he had a future. The streets were more crowded than usual, Galba noticed, but didn't think about it. Rome was always crowded. People always wanted to see the emperor. There was no reason to suspect that the faces in the crowd were watching too carefully, that hands rested too close to hidden weapons, that the tension in the air wasn't just ordinary Roman chaos. Then the first shout went up, not for Galba, for Otho. The name echoed off the stone buildings, bouncing from wall to wall, multiplying. Asterisk Otho, Otho Imperator. Asterisk men were pushing forward now, shoving through the crowd. And suddenly, the guards around Galba weren't guards anymore. They were part of the mob. Their swords sliding out, their eyes on the old man. Galba's litter crashed to the ground. He fell hard, his old bones jarring against stone, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Men were dying around him. Piso was already dead, cut down in the first seconds. The crowd was screaming, pushing, trampling the fallen. Someone grabbed Galba's hair, yanked his head back. The last thing he saw was a sky the color of iron and a face he almost recognized, one of his own soldiers. A man he'd paid, a man he'd trusted. Then the blade came down. They cut off his head. That was standard. The head of an enemy was proof, a trophy, something to be displayed. But the men who killed Galba went further. They cut off his hands too, tossed them into the crowd, watched people fight over the fingers of an emperor. The body lay in the forum for hours. No one touched it. No one claimed it. Just an old man in expensive clothes bleeding into the cracks between stones while the city adjusted to its new reality. Otho sat in the Praetorian camp, accepting their acclamation, promising them the Donativam Galba had refused. He was emperor now. He'd done it. He'd grabbed the purple and pulled it around his shoulders. And for one brief, glorious moment, he believed the hard part was over. He didn't know that messengers were already riding north. Didn't know that on the Rhine another general was reading the news with cold, calculating eyes. Didn't know that the empire was about to tear itself apart. But he'd find out. They all would. Here's what no one in Rome understood yet. The empire wasn't a thing you could own. It was a wound. An open, bleeding wound that had been festering for 100 years, ever since Augustus first gathered all power into his own hands and called it restoration. The Julio Claudians had kept the wound covered, had dressed it with propaganda and murder and the careful management of elites. But the infection never healed. It just spread. Nero's death ripped the bandage off, and now everyone could see what was really inside. Otho thought he'd won. But winning in Rome didn't mean what he thought it meant. It didn't mean control. It didn't mean safety. It meant you were now the target, the focus, the single point where all the pressure of the empire converged. He sat in the palace Galba had occupied, signing documents Galba had signed, receiving reports Galba had received. The same advisors bowed before him. The same guards stood outside his door. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. Because out there, beyond the walls, beyond the city, beyond the carefully controlled world of Roman politics, legions were marching. And legions didn't care about Otho's connections, didn't care about his popularity. Legions cared about victory, about plunder, about the man who could lead them to both.
A man was coming.
His name was Aulus Vitellius. He had 20,000 soldiers behind him. Northern Italy. Spring 69 AD, the two armies met near a small village called Bedriacum, not far from the Po River. Otho's forces held the better position. They'd arrived first. They'd fortified. They had every advantage of ground and supply. But they didn't have what Vitellius's men had. Rhine legions had spent years fighting real wars, not the ceremonial campaigns of imperial politics, not the parade ground maneuvers of soldiers who'd never seen combat. They'd fought Germans. Fought warriors who didn't care about Roman law, Roman order, Roman civilization. They'd learned to kill without hesitation, without mercy, without the complicated moral calculations that plagued soldiers who'd spent too long in peacetime. Otho's men were good. Vitellius's men were asterisk, dangerous asterisk. The battle lasted hours, maybe a day. The sources disagree. What they agree on is the aftermath: thousands dead, the fields turned to mud and blood, the Po running red with bodies. And Otho's army, broken. He got the news in Brixlum, where he'd waited with his staff while the battle unfolded. His officers urged him to fight on. There were still legions in Dalmatia, in Pannonia, in Moesia. They could regroup. They could try again. Otho listened, nodded, then dismissed them all. That night, alone in his quarters, he wrote letters. To his brother, to his nephew, to a woman he'd loved, once before Rome consumed everything. He asked for their forgiveness, asked them to remember him kindly. Then he placed a dagger against his throat, the same way Nero had done it, the same way the Julio Claudians had ended, one by one, as the empire they'd built turned against them. He pushed, and Rome had its second emperor in 4 months. Vitellius entered Rome like a conqueror, which he was, technically. He'd won. His men had killed Otho's men, and Otho had killed himself, and the path to the palace was clear. All he had to do was walk through it. but walking through it meant seeing what he'd actually won. The city was starving. The grain shipments from Africa had stopped during the chaos, and no one had restarted them. People were eating food they wouldn't have fed to animals a year ago. Children died in the streets. Bodies piled up outside the walls because there was no one to bury them. The treasury was empty. Galba had emptied it trying to buy loyalty. Otho had emptied what remained trying to buy an army. Now Vitellius inherited nothing but debt and desperate men demanding payment. The Senate hated him. It acclaimed him because they had no choice, but their smiles were thin, their congratulations hollow. They remembered how he'd gotten here, remembered the blood, remembered that he'd marched on Rome with foreign legions, breaking a taboo as old as the Republic. And his own soldiers were turning on him. They'd followed him because they expected plunder, expected wealth, expected the kind of reward that made civil war worthwhile. But Rome was empty. The rich had fled. The temples had been stripped by previous emperors. There was nothing left to take. Vitellius sat in the palace and watched it all crumble. He started drinking, eating, trying to fill the void with sensation, with excess, with anything that would distract him from the truth he couldn't face. He wasn't an emperor. He was a placeholder. And the real threat hadn't even arrived yet. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He was 60 years old, the son of a tax collector, which meant the Roman aristocracy considered him vulgar, common beneath them. He'd spent his career in the provinces, commanding legions in Britain, governing Africa, doing the actual work of empire, while men like Vitellius partied in Rome. And right now, he was in Judea, putting down a rebellion. Soldiers loved him. Not because he was charming, he wasn't. Not because he was generous, he was famously cheap. They loved him because he was competent, because when he gave an order it made sense, because when they followed him into battle they usually won. The news of Vitellius's accession reached him in Caesarea.
Yes.
He read the reports, listened to the messengers, then called his officers together and asked a simple question. Should I do this? The answer was obvious. Of course he should. The empire was falling apart. The man in Rome was a drunk who'd lost control of his own soldiers. The legions in the east were loyal to Vespasian, had been loyal for years, would follow him anywhere. But there was a problem. Egypt. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain supply. Whoever controlled the grain supply controlled Rome. If Vespasian marched on Italy without securing Egypt first, Vitellius could starve the city and blame Vespasian for it. So Vespasian didn't march. Sent his friend Gaius Licinius Mucionus with an army, told him to take his time, to let Vitellius destroy himself, to arrive in Rome only when the city was ready to welcome a savior. Then he waited. And in Rome, Vitellius waited too. We're both waiting for the same thing. December 69 AD, the city burned for 3 days, not on purpose, not the way Nero's fire had been if it had been a calculated act of destruction. This was chaos fire. Accident fire. The kind that happens when an army loses discipline and starts seeing everything as fuel. Vitellius's soldiers had finally turned completely. They roamed the streets in gangs, looting temples, breaking into homes, dragging women and children into the alleys. The Praetorians tried to stop them and failed. The urban cohorts tried and died. There was no order left, no authority, no one to say asterisk. Stop asterisk. Vitellius hid in the palace, could hear the sounds of the city dying, the screams, the crashes, the crackle of flames spreading from building to building. His servants had fled. His guards had joined the looters. He was alone. I'd found him anyway. Not Vespasian's men. They were still outside the city, waiting for the right moment. No, the men who found Vitellius were his own soldiers. The ones he'd led across the Alps. The ones he'd promised wealth and victory. They dragged him through the streets, naked, beaten, his hands tied behind his back. The crowd that gathered didn't throw things. They were too exhausted for that. They just watched, stared, followed the procession of a broken man being led to his death. At the Gemonian stairs they stopped. This was where they executed enemies of the state, where Galba's head had been displayed, where the bodies of the fallen were left for dogs and birds. Someone grabbed Vitellius's hair, pulled his head back. They killed him slowly, pieces, with small knives and dull blades, and the kind of cruelty that only comes from men who have been promised everything and given nothing. When it was over, they threw his body into the Tiber. It floated for a while, tangled in the garbage and sewage before sinking beneath the dark water. And somewhere outside the city, Vespasian's men were finally marching in. The empire had survived. Barely bleeding, burned. 4 emperors in 1 year. Hundreds of thousands dead. The treasury empty. The city scarred. Every system strained to breaking. Every assumption challenged. Every rule rewritten. Vespasian would rebuild, would restore, would found a new dynasty, a new order, a new way of ruling that would last for decades. But he never forgot what he'd seen, what they'd all seen. That the empire wasn't bronze and marble, wasn't law and tradition, wasn't even the legions or the Senate or the 1,000-year dream of Rome. The empire was fear, pure and simple. The fear of what came next, of who would grab power next, of when the killing would start again, and that fear, it never went away, just waited, watching, patient, ready for the next time someone reached for purple.